I'm going to give you a brief introduction to coffee, where it started to grow, how it's grown all over the world now, and how it's harvested, processed, roasted, and sent and used in your home or in the shop that you go and visit. So there's a couple of different stories about where coffee originated from, and the location is either between Ethiopia or Yemen. They're very close together, so it was probably a combination of the two when borders didn't exist. So it was in that region, and it was discovered by a goat herder, as the legend goes, and he realised his a little bit strange after. Oh no! Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah, can still hear you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, yeah.
Just the video just stopped. I'm gonna just talk for a little bit then, and then I'll try and get the video back up and running in a little bit. So the goats started to act really hyperactive after eating this one crop. The goat herder realised what crop they were eating, and it was the coffee bush or the coffee plant, and he decided to start eating the berries, which weren't very tasty, but they gave him a bit of an invigorating energy. He then decided to take the seeds out, cook them, grind them down, and boil them, which is what the first instance of coffee was. It then took a while for it to start spreading through the region, but because of the Silk Road, which pretty much passed through the area where coffee was discovered, it soon spread all the way to Italy and in Venice, where it moved into what it is today. So that's the rough, brief history. A lot of it is legend. It's really hard to say what's true or what isn't. But generally speaking now, in the world of coffee, there's two types. You've got a Robusta and you've got Arabica. I'm sure you've heard these terms before. Arabica is probably a bit more high-end market than Robusta. Robusta grows a little bit more easily and it's a bit cheaper. So most of the coffee you drink in chains or hotels or bed and breakfasts, things like that, will use Robusta. And in Far East Asia, they tend to use Robusta a lot because it grows very readily in places like Vietnam. But Arabica these days takes up about 80% of the market share of coffee. So generally speaking, specialty coffee only uses Arabica beans. Now, you can have bad quality Arabica beans and you can have good quality Arabica beans. So if someone says we have Arabica coffee, it doesn't mean it's really good. It just means it's a type of bean. So from there versus the commodity industry is places that commercially roast coffee. So thinking about like Nescafe, Nespresso, Starbucks, McDonald's, Pret, those sorts of places will use commodity sourced coffee, whereas independent coffee shops tend to use specialty coffee. Specialty coffee is coffee that's sourced using very sustainable approaches. So farmers get a very good wage. The money that's used is generally invested back into the community. And from there, the quality increases. So okay. Sorry, 1 second. Can you see me? Is it working again?
No.
I have no idea what's going on again. On my back? Yes.
Yay, we can see you.
So I'm going to show you what coffee is. I'm sure you've seen it. So it comes in bean form, like this. But to get it to this stage requires a lot of processing. So coffee is actually a fruit, and it grows with a tree. It looks like a cherry. And inside the cherry, you'll have two seeds like this, but they're green normally. So you harvest it in two different ways. You've got a washed process and you've got a natural process. Both have big impacts on the flavor of the coffee. But ultimately, it's removing the seeds from the fruit, and then from there, it gets roasted. So with a washed process, all of the flesh of the fruit is removed. In the natural process, the fruit is harvested and left on raised sunbeds to dry in the sun, and then the seeds are removed. So once it's gone down there, they get shipped out to whoever wants to buy any. We buy in the UK from loads of different sources, but they come green and dry to us. And then we spend our time roasting them and ending up in with beans like this. So if you've had instant coffee before, which I'm sure a lot of you have, where you just add hot water to it and it turns it into coffee, there's a common misconception that it's just ground coffee beans. What it actually is then freeze dried and it's granulated. That's what instant coffee is. The coffee that I've sent to you guys, I know some of you haven't received them or not, is actually just ground up coffee beans. And when you brew coffee, whether it's espresso or filter coffee, or if you use your stovetop, you're creating a sort of infusion using the ground up coffee. So you don't physically end up consuming the whole bean like you would in instant. I'll show you a little bit later on because I can give you some examples of it. But does that make sense so far? Does anyone have any questions before I continue? No? Right. Okay, so when did I get into coffee making? Well, it was pretty much my first job since finishing university. I needed to get some money in. There wasn't any jobs in my sector that I finished uni in. So I started working in coffee shops, and since then it kind of has intrigued me and interested me, and I've been in it now for about 10 years in various positions. So I started making coffee behind the bar, and then I ended up working in roasteries, training people how to make coffee, tasting coffee, being involved in the buying process, and now I run and own my own coffee shop. So I've gone through pretty much all the different levels of making it, and I'm still very passionate about it today, which is good. So not sure if it's really said what's the difference between coffee mark number one. So this hasn't been talked about yet, but I'm gonna, if you've had your coffee arrived, we're gonna brew number one together, and we're gonna brew number two together, so we can try and taste the difference. So I don't want to give too much away, but it's down to the roasting process. So number one, which was this one, has been roasted a little bit longer than number two, which is this one. So that's the main difference between the two. The beans are from different places as well. Number two comes from Sumatra, and number one is a blend of Brazilian and Colombian coffee. So we'll get to that one. So yeah, I'll continue then, because I kind of talked about where coffee came from a little bit, so I'd like to expand on that. Coffee requires very specific environmental things to grow, basically. So it can't grow that well in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. It pretty much grows only between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, and it has to grow at quite a high altitude. So it needs very tropical weather conditions. So you won't be able to find any growing in England, for example, any that will taste good. But it can grow in India, it can grow in Hawaii, it can grow in Jamaica, it can grow in Colombia. So basically anywhere along the belt in the world. So along the tropics and in between Capricorn and Cancer. The most interesting coffee these days probably comes from Africa. So Kenya has really interesting coffee. Ethiopia has as well. But there's good stuff now coming out from East Asia. So China has started growing coffee. It's early stages, but they're producing some really nice coffee at the minute. Yemen in Africa is getting some very strange flavors. So you end up getting coffee that tastes almost like pine, very herby, very interesting. So not traditional coffee flavors. I'll have you know. So I'm going to maybe go into the different methods of drinking coffee. So going from probably the first instance of making coffee was probably in the Arab culture, where you basically boil the coffee. I don't know if you've seen the devices before, but they're quite interesting. You double boil it, and you're consuming quite a thick slurry of ground coffee, and it turns into this really thick liquid, super strong, and it's quite bitter. And normally you'll find it flavored with aromatics, so like cardamom. It's quite a common flavor used. And from there, you probably go to an espresso, which was pioneered in Italy, and from there it pretty much boomed around the world. Now, what an espresso is coffee that's been brewed at a very high temperature under very high pressure. So we're talking about 9 bars of coffee, which is pressure, which is 9 atmospheres, which is what gives you the really creamy top, which is called crema. So if you've seen an espresso before, I'm sure you've seen a nice thick layer on the top of the surface. That's basically the oils of the coffee, and the only way you can really extract the oils in that amount is by grinding it really fine, like you do in espresso, and also brewing it at very high pressure. Moving on to that, it's probably filter coffee. Now there's loads of different instances of filter coffee. We're going to brew one today a little bit later on in something called the V60, which uses a conical mask. Let's come out again. Am I back? Yes. Another type of filter coffee is a mocha master, which is like this, which is commonly used in Northern Europe, so places like Sweden or Norway. Very common, you'll find that in every home over there. So moving on, you can drink it as a cold brew, if anyone's had a cold brew before, which is basically using cold water to extract lots of coffee flavors from it. And I think that's pretty much all the different types of consuming coffee. So yeah, do you have any other questions? Because I want to get on with giving you a little tutorial on how to make good coffee from home. And actually, if any of you did have your packs arrive, now is a good time to start prepping everything. My favorite coffee bean type is probably Arabica. And at the minute, probably my favorite comes from Kenya, because it's full of very ripe, fruity flavors. I prefer more fruity flavors with my coffee. So probably not traditional. Most traditional coffees taste a bit more chocolatey and a bit more nutty. I prefer a bit more fruity, because for me, coffee is a fruit, so it kind of should taste a little bit like that. So what coffee should we avoid? It's quite a tricky one, because it's quite subjective. It depends on your personal tastes. But generally speaking, you want to avoid coffee that can't tell you what countries produced it, what farm it was produced in, and even the name of the farmer. Without that sort of transparency, somewhere down the line, someone's not getting paid what they're supposed to be getting paid, if that makes sense. So so places, I don't want to name and shame, but generally the chains out there don't really source their coffee in very ethical means. So if you can avoid that, coffee is good. So what makes it great to you? What's the perfect coffee? What makes a great coffee? So consistency is the key for me, and that's what makes a great coffee. It depends on how you like to drink it. So if you're going to drink an espresso, the preparation and the sourcing of the coffee is important. If you're drinking a filter coffee, I would argue the same is applicable. But for me, the perfect coffee is a filter coffee. No milk, no sugar, drink it black and as pure as it comes. So I'm going to show you, I'll show you how to make one today, and hopefully everyone can start drinking good coffee from now on. So yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so hopefully, I can't really see because everyone's got their cameras off, but if your coffee packs did arrive, I can take you through it now. If it hasn't arrived, I would still watch this because I'm going to be showing you a lot of the methods that you should be using whenever you're making filter coffee at home. So I'm just going to go ahead and start, if that's okay. So we're going to use something called a V60 today. This was invented in Japan, but it's a tried and tested method of making filter coffee from Brazil, other parts of Europe. They have their own versions of this, but the V60 is probably the most popular one. So you start with one of these and you start with your filter paper. Now, it's always good practice to give your filter paper a rinse once it's in place. Now, the reason we do that is we don't want to get any paper flavors in our coffee. So a very simple way of doing it is putting it over your vessel, whether it's a mug or something like this that I pour. And I'm just going to fill it up with boiling water. Now, I did mention to you guys about using filtered water or bottled water if you can, because it's very, very important for the flavors of the coffee. If you use just tap water, it's been treated so much that it's got chlorine inside, it's got very heavy metals in there, it's got lots of dissolved solids in there, which we don't want. So if you guys are in London at the minute, I'm sure you realize when you have a shower, you see lots of limescale starting to build up. We want to avoid any of those minerals in the water because it doesn't lend to making a good coffee. So I've used filtered water here. Bottled water is fine. So to get the filter ready, we're just going to wet the paper just like this. Just make sure it's all wet through and just let it run. So I'm just going to discard that water because we don't want to drink any of that. And we're going to put this back. So the best temperature whenever you're brewing coffee is straight off the boil. A lot of places recommend maybe about 92, around that margin. But to extract all the flavors, the hotter the water is, the better it is. So if you're brewing at home, straight off the kettle is the perfect temperature. So hopefully all of your kettles have boiled now and you're ready. So we're going to brew number 1 first. So you should have your coffee pre-ground to the correct weight and size. So if you just pour it directly onto your paper filter, just like that. So I just want to show you. So just pop it straight in, try and level it out, make it as flat as possible. I'm just gonna hopefully wait until you guys have done that. It's hard to tell. All of you guys are too shy, you've put your cameras off. Cool. I'm gonna assume everybody's ready. So the first stage of brewing coffee, you just want to pour enough coffee to cover the water to make sure all of your coffee is saturated. So I'm going to do that now. So just pouring very gently over the top. And that's enough. I'm just going to give it a bit of a swirl like this because that ensures all the coffee has been touched by all of the water. And if you're doing this correctly, you should be able to see some bubbles forming and almost a lighter creamy color on the top as well. And we're going to let that sit for about 30 seconds. So we're letting it sit for 30 seconds to allow any gas that's been formed during the roasting process to be expelled. And this is CO2 gas, just so you know. So normally once the bubbles have stopped forming, then's a good time to pour the remaining water in. So I'm ready to do that now. So I'm just gonna gently pour the water directly on the top of the coffee. I'm trying to avoid hitting the paper first. And I'm just gonna quickly pour water in so it fills up around 3/4 of the vessel, just like that. And then we stop. And then we just let it brew now. So this is called the drawdown stage, and we want this whole process to last around 3 minutes. If this process lasts a bit longer than 3 minutes, it generally indicates that the coffee has been ground too fine and it's creating too much resistance for the water to pass through. So if you imagine you've got a bucket with holes in it full of rocks and a bucket full of sand, and you pour water down the top, it's going to come through the one with stones too quickly, and it'll come through the sand too slowly. We're looking for somewhere in between. How's everyone getting on? Are you going okay? Good, okay, good. I don't know if you can smell what's going on right now. It'd be good if you could get your nose in there and really smell, because coffee is all about the aromas as well. Aromas make up about 70% of the flavors. So it's a good indication of what the flavor of the coffee is going to be based on the smell. So you should be coming up to the stage where the brewing is going to stop. If it takes any longer than 3 minutes, what I would suggest is just taking it off and discarding the remaining liquid. But right now we're on the track. We're on the right track right now, which is good. Cool. It's the same amount of coffee for all types of coffee. Good question. So The amount of coffee that you're using today is about 15 grams. That's normal for one person to drink in one portion. If you're making espresso, the most common weight these days is around 18 grams of coffee for a double espresso, which yields around 35 milliliters of liquid. Whereas this, you'll end up with about 200 mil of liquid using 15 grams of coffee. So it completely varies on the method that you're using, but generally speaking, if you're making filter coffee, you want to use 60 grams of coffee for every 1 liter of water that you use. And that's all encompassing. So every single filter method would use a similar one. If you're using espresso, it's slightly different, and it varies on what shop is making the coffee, what company is making the coffee, and how dark or how light the coffee is. So it varies, but it's loosely the same. So with espresso, it's normally 2-to-1 ratio. So you've got 1 part of coffee to 2 parts of liquid, and then filter coffee, as we discussed. So I'm just going to remove this now because we're ready. And you should have a nice liquid. I've got a nice glass here that you can see, but it's quite a dark, deep amber liquid there. Smells quite full-bodied, quite strong, which is good. So I'm just going to pour this and leave it to one side because we're going to come back to that one. I would like you to would like you to brew your next cup if possible. I'm going to do this quickly for the people that don't have their stuff with them. But we're going to follow exactly the same process here. You want your filter paper wet, just to give it a good rinse, which I'm going to do now. Also, make sure that you're keeping your coffee in the correct area, because that's coffee 1. Don't get muddled up with coffee 2, otherwise it will ruin the lesson. So don't forget to discard your water as well. So we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to put all the coffee in, like so. And make sure it's nice and level, just by giving it a few gentle taps. I'm going to put that on the top. And we're going to start brewing again. So we're just covering the coffee here, just making sure all of it's wet, so it's saturated. Giving it a good stir, just to make sure it's all touched by the water, so we can kickstart the brewing process. Let all the CO2 gas release. And once the bubbles stop, we can carry on. So if you want to smell this one now, you should smell quite a big difference between the two. This one's has a bit more sweetness to it. It's a bit more fruity, I would say. Okay, and now I'm just going to pour the remaining water in. Cool. I'm just going to let that brew. Hope everyone's getting on well. Do you have any questions regarding this process now, or anything else? No. Okay, good. So I don't know how you drink your coffee normally, but we would never recommend drinking this type of coffee with any milk or any sugar. And the reason for that is the coffee that we're brewing now is going to be quite delicate with its flavors, probably closer to tea than coffee, like espresso coffee, than it is to anything else. So you should have quite a delicate brew here. It's not going to take your head off. It's full of caffeine, but yeah. So yeah, this is how I normally drink my coffee, to answer your question. And if you want to make a cold brew, it's a very different process. You have to grind your coffee quite coarse, and you add cold water to it. Make sure it's filtered water, which is very important, and you brew it overnight in the fridge. So you normally brew cold brew anywhere from 18 to 24 hours, and then after it's brewed, you want to filter out the coffee like we're doing now in a very similar way, and that's how you make cold brew. There's different methods of making it, but that's the most consistent and the easiest way of drinking coffee. So yeah, but yeah, I go through this ritual every morning and every afternoon and any other time of the day where I'm drinking coffee. When I was working in a roastery, we drank it in a slightly different way, because we had to work out the differences between the roasts. We would drink them all in a line, and you would add ground coffee like that's come out of this bag, and you just add hot water to it, and you almost drink it like you're drinking a hot soup. So you slurp the coffee to aerate it as you're drinking it, and that's how I would normally have drunk coffee, but that was in a previous job. If you've never gone to a cupping session, I would definitely recommend it. Obviously, right now, due to lockdown and things like that, it can't happen. But when things start opening up again, I would do a lot of research and try and find a place that does cuppings that are local to you. And they're very, very interesting because it will teach you so many different things about coffee and how it tastes and how it's roasted. And you should be able to pick out all of the little differences in flavor, which is what I find so interesting about coffee. So I've got this coffee here, and this one's still about brewing. I think I'll just take it off now, and I'll give it a pour. So yeah, I don't think I've heard of what kind of grind is best for filter coffee. So depending on how much coffee you're making, grind size is variable. I would say it's a medium grind in general. So if you're brewing for an espresso, it's almost like a very, very fine sand. If you're brewing for filter coffee, it's probably closer to table salt, like if that makes any sense. So it's a little bit coarser, but the more coffee you're brewing in one go, the coarser the coffee has to be. So if you're brewing 1 liter of coffee, it has to be quite coarse. Otherwise, you'll overbrew the coffee and you'll end up with very unpleasant, bitter, astringent flavors, which we're not looking for in coffee. Coffee should be sweet. It should have very sweet flavors to it. If your coffee is bitter, it's been brewed wrong, or it's been roasted too long, or it's just not good quality. I hope that answers your question. So hopefully you've brewed your coffees now. I'm going to assume you have, if you had your coffee. If you haven't had it sent to you yet, hopefully you can watch this video back and follow the instructions. But we're going to drink the first one first. Now, I'll talk to you a little bit about this coffee before we begin. It's a coffee that's been roasted for espresso. Now, espresso coffee generally tends to be a little bit darker than coffee that's roasted for filter coffee. However, there are things called omni roast, which works for both methods, but they generally don't tend to be that good. So if you're going to get an espresso, get espresso roasted coffee. If you want filter coffee, get coffee roasted for filter. Now, every good independent coffee shop that sells coffee will be able to help you on this if you go. So don't worry about that. Now, because this coffee's been roasted a little bit darker, that means it's been in the roasting machine for a couple of minutes longer. That's all it means. So if you roast for less time, you end up with a lighter roast. If you roast for a darker, if you roast for longer, you'll end up with a darker roast. I know it's pretty self-explanatory, but that's the basic science behind it. When you roast for longer, you tend to roast off the natural sugars that are present in the coffee, which ends up with you end up with a more full-bodied coffee with less natural sweetness to it. So the super dark roast, you might have seen things being called a city roast or French roast or traditional roast. If you've seen those words, it tends to be roasted quite dark, and they're more suited to people who like to add milk and sugar to their coffee, or they're used to it. But you can have a darker roasted coffee that hasn't been roasted too dark, where you don't need to add any sweetness to it or sugars. So we'll give this a taste now quickly. Hopefully some of you have a coffee right now. But this actually is quite a sweet one. You end up with an aftertaste of toffee, of almost like a caramel sweetness as well, and you get like a really dark chocolate bitterness to it, which is quite nice. Moving on to the Sumatran coffee. Now, Sumatra, generally speaking, has had really bad quality coffee for a very long time. It's only until recently where you have more and more roasters investing in farms in Sumatra, where the level has gone up, which is where sustainability comes into it. Because if a roaster invests money into a farm and they put that money back into the crops, you end up with a win-win situation where the farmers get lots more money for their crops because of that higher quality. The roaster's happy because he ends up with a better quality product, and hopefully the customer's happy because they're buying a better quality product. So it's a good process. So Sumatra in the last couple of years have come on massively with the quality and tastes of their coffee. What we have here is a natural coffee. So I don't know if you remember, I mentioned natural coffee and washed coffee. This one is a washed coffee. This one is a natural coffee. So natural coffees have the fruit of the bean drying on it during its process. It's then removed afterwards. So the beans or the seeds end up having a lot more sugar and a lot more fruity flavors ultimately left in it. So it should be a lot sweeter than this one. Let's give it a go. So yeah, I think maybe some of you might find it a little bit more sour if you're not used to these flavors. Maybe a little bit more like a white wine acidity going on in there, or like a fruit juice almost with its acidity there. But yeah, can anyone taste the difference between the two? If everyone's brewed one, I'm hoping you have. But if not, you should be able to taste the big difference between the two coffees here. But out of the two, this one is definitely my favorite. Yeah, it is. That's a good description. Loud is a good description. There's a lot more going on in it. There's a lot more complexity. Yeah, exactly. It's a good one. So yeah, this is a bit more like a standard coffee. This one is a bit more of like a wow. Is this actually coffee? It's pretty cool. But yeah, I'm guessing all of you drink coffee as well, by the way. Well, I hope you all do. Anyway. Does anyone else want to share how their tasting experience? No, don't be shy. What is the most popular roast at Good as Gold? So we don't really have one. Second one is so good. Yes, I'm so glad you like the second one more. I think that was the purpose of this this experiment. So it depends on the age group. I don't want to put people in brackets, but the older generation prefer more traditional roasts, which is more in this bracket of coffee, and the younger generation tend to go for this type of coffee. So yeah. So if we brew a big bunch of coffee, how do we have it later? So there's two ways of doing it. I would brew when you want to drink it, because it's better when it's fresh. If that's not possible, what I'd recommend is investing in like a thermos flask or a vacuum flask, so it keeps the heat locked in. They generally last about 3 or 4 hours of keeping the heat in. I wouldn't recommend reheating it or using one of these machines behind me and using the hot plate, because what tends to happen is it starts to stew a little bit, where you kind of cook off too much of the water and you end up with a weird coffee syrup, which is not the best thing. So yeah, I'd recommend brewing individually and consuming it very quickly, or getting a vacuum flask. So what coffee do you recommend for someone who normally does not drink coffee? So I would, if you drink milk or an alternative milk, I would recommend ordering maybe a latte or a flat white or a cappuccino, something with milk in it, because milk is very good at taking away from the bitterness of coffee, and it can bring out some sweetness too. So yeah, I would go for a latte. So it depends on where you go. If you go to a McDonald's or a Starbucks and you order a latte, their coffee is really dark and quite bitter. So you'd get a little bit of that coming through the milk. But maybe start off with a single shot latte. So instead of getting a double espresso, have a single espresso and put a bit of milk in there. If that's your thing. If not, I would recommend a light roast like this, because you don't get too much bitterness from it. If it's brewed correctly, you shouldn't get any bitterness. It should be quite sweet, quite fruity, and quite pleasant to enjoy, almost like a herbal tea. It's probably not the best description, but it's similar. So yeah, that's what I would recommend. Does anyone else have any questions? Or would anyone like me to go over anything I've discussed in a little bit more detail? Because I did quite a brief description of all the things. So if anyone wants me to go into more detail, I'm happy to do so. But going back to the question about Good as Gold and the popular roasts, I would say that these days the most popular coffee is definitely a flat white at the minute, and pretty much the most popular milk these days is probably oat milk. So we sell more oat flat whites than we ever have in the past 4 years, 5 years, I would say. So I would say that's the most popular drink. I don't know why. I don't know what's caused it. I think because flat whites use less milk, and people have slowly gone off drinking too much milk, because they're only small. They're about 6 fluid ounces, so about 180 mils of liquid there. So yeah, love an oat flat white. Good. What's the best thing to pair with coffee? Interesting. Anything sweet, I would say. So coffee and chocolate go well together as well. So a brownie, a cookie, pastries of some sort. I think that will probably, donuts, definitely donuts. There's actually a really good donut coffee shop that you guys should check out if you haven't. It's called Crosstown Donuts. They do really good donuts and they do really good coffee. It's like a match made in heaven if you like both of them. And I think they have vegan donuts now as well, which is good. Where is it? So central London. They've got quite a few different. There is quite a few. I think there's one in Soho, if I remember. And I think there's, they're around that area, like Fitzrovia, Soho sort of area. I've seen two. I think there's one in Box Park in Shoreditch, but I'm not 100% on that one. There's a good link. I should let them know that I'm plugging them. Maybe they'll give me some free donuts. But yeah. Bread Ahead is really good as well, yeah. They're really good. We used to work with Bread Ahead. They used to supply us, which was good. Could I just ask, did anyone like the first brew if they made it? It's not that bad. This one's much better. It is. I guess that's the point of more traditional roasts. It tends to be a lot more smooth and a lot more palatable for a lot of people because it hasn't got the sort of sharpness and acidity that this one has. And with this one, for example, you can't really add milk and sugar to it because it just wouldn't work. But with this one, you can add milk to it and it works well together. You bring out a lot more of the toffee, a lot more of the caramel flavors from it. But yeah, I guess different coffees for different occasions. So if you are actually, I'll give you a few little tips here. If you are buying coffee from anywhere and you want something really fruity and really interesting, look for the words natural, because that normally indicates that you'll end up with a very fruity cup. Also, look out for coffee from Kenya or Ethiopia or Uganda. They tend to be the fruitiest out there. And there's some good Colombian stuff as well, good Costa Rican stuff. Natural Costa Rican stuff, really, really fruity. And if you want something a bit more traditional, a little bit more chocolatey in its flavor notes, a bit more nutty, look for Nicaraguan coffee, Brazilian coffee. Colombian tends to be pretty good for that as well. So South America tends to be a bit more chocolatey. Africa tends to be a little bit more interesting and fruity. Just a little thing. Where can I get these coffee bags? So you can buy them from us if you want to. I think there was a link where you get 10% off in the email earlier, or go to any good independent coffee shop if you can and support your local business, because coffee shops are struggling at the minute. So buying coffee from any of them will be very good. So, but you can buy from us as well if you want. But yeah, these bags of coffee. Oh yeah, it's in the Facebook group. Sorry, not in the email. But these are from a London-based roaster. And right now, London is probably one of the best places in Europe, I would say, that have such a diversity of specialty coffee. So yeah, there's a few good ones in Northern Europe, like Sweden and Denmark, and even Germany. They have quite a few good roasteries. But London, I would say, is booming right now for independent specialty roasters, and you could probably pick a new roaster every day and not run out of roasters for half a year. It's ridiculous. So where is the fruity from? So this one, number 2, is from Sumatra. How about at the end of this session, I'll send a little information pack on each of the two coffees, and you can find out, because it's I can read it out to you, but I don't know if you'll remember them. But it's from a cooperative in Sumatra. So yeah, I'll let you know where you can get that one from. But we have it in stock at the minute if you wanna get it from us as well. So yeah, we could do that. These guys are based in Islington, North London. So yeah, any other questions from anyone? One usage. What do you do for all the coffee grinds? Ah, okay. So you can do a number of things with it. One good thing to do with it is if you let it dry out fully and you're growing any vegetables, or if you have any house plants or anything like that, you can put coffee in there, and it's full of nutrients that is very good for soil and very good for plants if you want to raise the acidity slightly. So it's very, very good for that. Otherwise, you can recycle it, or you can find. We work with a supplier that uses coffee grinds to further break them down and turn them into oil, which they can use for fuel. But generally speaking, you probably just throw it away, or use it in compost, or actually you can use it as an exfoliant. It's quite good. So if you mix it in with your face wash, you can use that, or your body wash. It's good at being a scrub. If you want a more natural exfoliant, it's good for that. So yeah, it might get though. Okay, I think that's it. Unless anyone has any few more questions, I can stop. I think our email address was added into the Facebook group as well. So if any of you want to ask me any questions, any tips, any advice, feel free to message me, and I'll get back to you. So yeah, and when we open, you can come down and visit if you want.